So our fourth speaker is Max Goller, who is a tenure-track faculty at CISPA. He's going to speak about how does connecting online activities to advertising inferences impact privacy perceptions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kovila. It's my great pleasure to be here and present joint work with my colleagues Florian, David, and Adam, who is also in the audience. And today I'd like to explain what happens if end users are asked to connect the dots between their online activities and their advertising inferences. So before we dive into this paper, I'm sorry, I have a sore throat. Would like to quickly summarize how Google's online behavioral advertisement ecosystem works. Pretty sure many in this room are aware of this, but just to recap, Google finances most of its free services by recording your online activities. And for example, if you do a Google search or something, or you ask Google Maps for directions, or watch a video on YouTube. And what happens then is, based on those collected activities, Google tries to infer your interests. For example, based on my activity where I watched this Lord of the Rings video, Google's algorithm inferred that I might be interested into movie soundtracks. And then finally, using the inferred interests, advertisers can then target me, for example, by displaying an ad for a new pair of premium headphones that are particularly suited for listening to movie soundtracks. That's Google's behavioral advertisement ecosystem in a nutshell. Next, I'd like to quickly talk about our prior work because it nicely connects and is a follow-up what I want to present here today. And back then, we explored Google's activity collection dashboard, and this is called My Activity. And very interestingly here is we found that Google benefits from offering this dashboard, as people significantly decrease their level of concern and perceived benefit from data collection after visiting the dashboard. That's rather surprising. And today we want to go one step further in Nissenbaum's data food chain metaphor and have a look at inferences. So the second step, essentially. For this, the dashboard is called Google Ad Settings, and you have heard about this in Nathan's talk already. It lists all your interests that Google has inferred about you and allows you to turn off individual interests or disable ad personalization completely. And you should note that following the completion of our study on this topic, the service was revised and is now called My Ad Center. So ad settings distinguishes 5 different interest types, and the 2 biggest are aggregated inferences and activity-based inferences. An example for this, for aggregated inferences is parental status, your household income, or your educational level, that Google estimates as the collected activities are very similar to other people in this category that have shared this information with Google. And activity-based inferences here is an example, home and garden, or it could also be my interest in movie soundtracks. And those are sorted into 26 topics and consisting of overall more than 2,400 different interests. And then, of course, when we learned about the surprising effect of my activity, we speculated a bit and thought the result could be owed to the disconnect of what data is collected versus how that data is used. And we concluded that current privacy dashboards do not sufficiently connect the dots in the data food chain. And in this work now, we wanted to evaluate if connecting activities to advertising interests stabilizes the perceived benefit and concern of online data collection. And to do so, we asked end users to participate in a labeling task that we came up with and review a selection of their actual Google activities and then assign ad interests they believed Google learned from those activities. For this, we conducted an interactive online study with 170 participants on Prolific, and they all installed our custom-developed browser extension and then answered questions about their concerns and benefits of Google's data collection. We used a pre-post study design and then made use of 2 interventions. The first was this aforementioned labeling task, which I will describe in more detail later. And the second one was just showing the real list of their interests that Google has inferred from their web browsing behavior. And this is very similar to what we did in prior work. In between the interventions, of course, we ask participants questions about their concerns and perceived benefits of Google's data collection. And that's essentially the user study. Okay, now let's finally have a closer look at the labeling task. It's a quite unique component of our study and connects the activities that we extracted using the browser extension with interests that participants provided in a relatively simple task. At the top, we display an activity that we extracted from a list of the participants' own activities, and the activity is based, again, similar to prior work, either on Google Search, Maps, or YouTube. And we covered 3 different time periods that Google considers important. One that was 7 days old, an activity that was 3 months old, and one that was 18 months old. So overall, the labeling task repeated for 3 services and 3 different time periods, totaling in 9 repetitions. And then the job of the participant was effectively to reenact Google's inferencing algorithm by assigning interest labels they believed Google would apply to the activities that we displayed at the top. The user interface made use of auto-completion using Google AdWords and allowed to skip activities if they were considered too sensitive, for example. And we also allowed to create custom interest labels if participants felt the need for it. Okay, let's finally move on to our main findings. We did find that participants apply interest labels rather differently than Google does, as only about 1/3 of the applied labels occurred on the participants' ad settings page. From the 73% that did not appear, around about 30% were custom labels created by the participants. The main reasons why the applied interests did not appear were that they were too generic. A good example for this is participants labeled their activities with maps or images, which is very generic, or because they were overly specific. For example, Taylor Swift Red, which is a recent album, or Seattle Seahawks. Or because participants used banned or sensitive terms. Examples for this are COVID-19 or brewing. Or the label required simply too much context that Google could not possibly have when assessing the activity. Here there's a maps activity and the label was wedding gift, and Google could not have potentially been able to tell that. So to summarize, participants applied interest labels differently than Google does, and the labels were often too generic or overly specific. The more interesting question is, however, whether the labeling task made any difference. And well, here we find the labeling task did not cause any significant shift, which is essentially what we hoped for. In contrast, viewing the interests that Google applied causes again the significant decrease in concern. When having a look at the qualitative responses that we collected, we find that the decrease is mostly owed to the generic nature of the interests, which participants often perceived as low risk. So paradoxically, participants were less concerned after viewing their lists of interests because of their generic nature. However, at the same time, almost half of the participants reported that the interests that Google showed were extremely or moderately accurate. Moreover, participants had a median of at least 180 inferred interests. So we think it's important to consider what happens if so many generic and accurate interests are combined. Currently, end users seem not to be aware of this potential privacy threat. So to summarize our work, participants understood that interests are inferred from interactions with Google, but there's very little understanding about how those interactions are combined with other data. Labels were often generic or overly specific, which is different to what Google does, at least when they use this for ad targeting. Participants perceived the labels applied by Google to be generic and low risk. Thus, after viewing them, participants' concern decreased, and with that, unfortunately, the likelihood of them to manage their data. We think future work should focus on privacy dashboards that consider how the collected data is used, and we need to work on explaining how a number of low-risk labels can become dangerous if our privacy can become dangerous for our privacy if they are abused. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Questions.
Please, only easy questions.
There are a couple over there.
Great presentation. I was wondering, is there a list of like the banned inferences or labels, or is there a dictionary of AdWords that they could pull from, or is that available at all? Because that was fascinating that brewing is a banned term.
Yeah, there's, so ad settings has been revised, right? But we still have screenshots, and on those screenshots you can see the categories that are banned, and alcohol is one of them. And because there was manual labor involved, we labeled this brewing as alcohol related and thus a sensitive term. That's it. But there's no official list that I'm aware of.
Hello, thanks for the great talk. I had a question about the participants and how they label things as either too generic or overly specific. Were there like two types of participants, like type A were the overly generic, type B specific? Or could the same person be very generic and very specific?
Thank you for the question. It's a difficult question for me to answer because I didn't do the analysis. But I think my gut feeling is that there's not this type A, type B, but that people are all over the place.
Hi, thanks for the talk. So I presume if someone didn't label data, that you didn't then collect that data, so you only collected data from topics that were labeled.
Correct. The participants had the option to skip an activity and also provide a reason why they decided to skip it. But then we didn't collect the labels, of course not.
And so was there like any, did you have any ethical difficulty kind of getting this approved, or like any issues about maybe users reporting really sensitive data that they didn't mind reporting, but that was still
Yeah, we had the option. So at the very end of our study, because if you involve a browser extension, it's getting complicated. We had and again, and after written consent, which is a standard procedure, at the very end of the study, we again had the option to not send the data or withdrew the data. And again, as I said, there was the option to skip activities if they were considered too private or too sensitive. But it was an IRB-approved study, so yeah, we took measures.
Thanks.
Cool. Let's thank Max Gola again.
Thank you.